Hi, everybody, and welcome to the National Constitution Center. It is so wonderful to see you all. I am Jeffrey Rosen, the president of this wonderful institution, which is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. Beautiful.
Right on.
I'm so glad you were able to recite our mission statement because we're welcoming to Philadelphia my dear old friend Barry Edelstein, who is America's leading teacher of Shakespeare and translator of the great bard for all Americans. And I wanted him to see how engaged and well-trained our great members are in being able to recite our nonpartisan mantra.
Bravo.
This is a special pleasure, ladies and gentlemen. This program is sold out. You are lucky to get this ticket because this great Shakespearean is so electric and so vivid in being able to convey the importance of the bard. And we are going to take up a topic that, to my knowledge, has not been addressed before, and that is Shakespeare and the founders. How did Shakespeare influence the American framers? How did he influence American constitutionalism? And how does he influence the way that we think about liberty today? So I can't wait for the conversation, and I know it's going to be great. So Barry is the Erna Finke Viterbi artistic director of the Old Globe, which is one of the great Shakespeare theaters in America. It's in San Diego. They do Shakespeare, they do Broadway shows, and it's just a phenomenal institution. He has worked with the leading Shakespeareans in America, including Al Pacino, Kevin Kline, Gwyneth Paltrow. I've had the incredible pleasure of seeing his shows over the years, and they're just electric. He's worked at the Public Theater in New York. He's taught at Juilliard, NYU, and Yale, and he's the author of these two great books that I want you to read, Bardisms, Shakespeare for All Occasions, and this really powerful book, Thinking Shakespeare, which is the standard text on Shakespearean acting. So if you would like to learn how to recite the cadence of these great plays, read Thinking Shakespeare. Barry, welcome to Philadelphia.
Jeffrey, thank you.
So glad you're here.
Thank you. And may I just say what a huge honor and thrill it is for me to be here. And more than that, I want to congratulate Philadelphia on snaring Jeffrey. I can tell I can tell how much everybody here loves and reveres him. Obviously, I join you in that. But I've known this man for 30 years, right? Probably. And
28.
And the quality of his mind and his passion for what he does has been impressive and remarkable from the first second we met. And to see him thriving in this kind of position is such a joy for me. And I'm just happy to get an hour to schmooze with you here in front of your fans.
Well, we're going to have a great time. So there's a connection between Shakespeare and Philadelphia. And later today, you're going to go explore it. Tell us about the Shakespeare-Philadelphia connection.
Many. Well, obviously Philadelphia, one of the great American cities, and back in the early days of our country, the great American city. And so Shakespeare was here from the very beginning, from before the very beginning. Shakespeare was in the colonies. Jamestown was founded in 1603. That's the year Shakespeare wrote Hamlet. So, the people who were sailing over to settle the colonies of what would become the United States were people who, before they left, said, let me go catch what's on at the Globe. That was the material that was current at the time, and they brought it with them. And we know that a Native American theater tradition took a while to take hold, but English theater companies came over to play in the colonies. And our founders watched them, and they toured in places like Philadelphia, in the early cities of the country. So there was a Shakespeare presence here from the very beginning. But Philadelphia is distinguished by two important Shakespeareans. There was a Shakespeare Society of Philadelphia. Not sure it's still going, but I believe it may be in some way. And it was a group of basically lawyers, appropriate for us to be talking about, who devoted themselves to the amateur study of Shakespeare. The early 19th century, by the time it really got cooking, but was there from the earliest colonial days. And this is before the university English department, when Shakespeare became the province of specialists. It was really a gentleman amateurs kind of pursuit. So these lawyers would get together and they would hone their forensic skills by debating questions of Shakespeare. was Hamlet guilty of murdering Claudius, given that we know that he had a justification? We still do that. We still have moot cases where lawyers will gather and debate some question of Shakespearean justice. So that's what they did. And in the course of doing that, they accumulated this huge repository of Shakespeare knowledge, huge libraries of Shakespeare knowledge. And one of their members, a guy named Horace Howard Furness is a big name here locally, became the dean of the Shakespeare Society, and he published in the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century, what was called the New Variorum Shakespeare. It's an astonishing kind of Victorian era idea when the Google of the time was a big book that you would print. They actually thought, well, it is possible, theoretically, to gather everything that's ever been thought about a subject between the two covers of a book, and that's what Furness wanted to do. So he managed to do about 16 of the plays. His son did 3 more. And there are these extraordinary editions of the plays that gather all the scholarship that the Shakespeare Society of Philadelphia had gathered about all sorts of arcane questions of the text. What does this word mean? What's that reference over there? What has this actor done? What did those actors do? At the time, German scholarship was particularly important. There's a massive amount of 19th century German scholarship that's in these volumes. Furness himself was this extraordinary, witty, humane, tremendous guy. And whenever I direct Shakespeare to this day, I go to the Furness Variorum, if there is one on the play that I'm doing, because he's so in love with the material and wears his love for the material on his sleeve. Anyway, his library is at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm luckily, happily, going to get a little tour later this afternoon. So Horace Howard Furness, great Philadelphian. His brother, I think his name was James, was an architect, hundreds of... Frank, excuse me. Thank you.
Welcome to Philly.
Yes, got it sorted out.
Yes.
Yes, many distinguished buildings around the city, including, I think, the library building on the Penn campus where the Furness Library is located. So that's one of Philadelphia's greatest contributions to American Shakespeare. He's arguably the first truly great American Shakespearean, maybe the greatest ever American Shakespearean. He's a Philadelphia man. The second is the first great American Shakespearean actor, Edwin Forrest. Forrest is earlier, he's the 1830s or so, pre-Civil War. And he was the first guy to really create a Native American acting tradition. And what he did in separating from the English tradition is still the basic separation that we talk about today. You talk about American acting as being emotional and physical and muscular and raw, and English acting as being classical and upright, and and it's the difference between Kenneth Branagh and Al Pacino even today. Well, that was true then, and Forrest had this legendary rivalry with the greatest English actor of his time named Charles Macready. And Macready was the opposite, a dandified guy who was famous for his sing-song delivery of Shakespeare, his gorgeous costuming, his gestures that were very refined. And Forrest hated that and made this sweaty, sort of ferocious, virile, American pioneering kind of, axe-wielding sort of approach to Shakespeare. Got to the point where their rivalry got so intense that Forrest took a trip to England, and Macready was playing Hamlet, and at one moment he did this, Hamlet goes insane in the play, feigns madness. So Macready did this thing where he did a crazy dance with a handkerchief. It was his signature thing when Hamlet went mad. Yeah, right? Perfect. It's right up your street.
Yeah, that sounds great.
He did this crazy handkerchief dance, and it was famous, and people came to see what he's going to do. And so Forrest was there, and he got up and he hissed. He stood in the middle of the theater, standing there, and hissed. Famous, infamous moment, right? Macready became incensed. So in 1849, Macready was playing in New York at the Astor Opera House on Astor Place, right across the street from, interestingly, where the Public Theater is now on Lafayette Street. Forrest was playing down the street on the Bowery. And the rivalry between the two of them became so intense that it got violent. And there was a riot on the streets of New York between the partisans of Edwin Forrest and the partisans of Macready. Now, it also happens that Forrest's fans were Irish working men who hated the English anyway. So that was part of it. There were all sorts of other stuff. There was English war debt that was being discussed at the time. It's complicated stuff, but it crystallized around these two Shakespeareans having a duel blocks from each other. There was a rock quarry on the corner of what is now 3rd Avenue and St. Mark's. They busted down the gates, took these rocks, started pummeling each other, and dozens of people ended up dead in the streets as a result of this extraordinary rivalry. So Forrest was a Philadelphian and ended up willing his house. It was called the Home for Decayed Actors.
We need one for decayed constitutionalists as well.
We do. Yeah, because you're going to need somewhere to be.
Yes, I'm waiting.
And yes, and it was on Broad Street. It burned down in a terrible fire. Forrest owned a precious copy of the first folio of Shakespeare, the first complete works of Shakespeare printed in 1623. It burned in that fire. Someone rescued the fragments, and they too are in the library in the Furness Center at the University of Pennsylvania, which I'm going to go check out, make a little pilgrimage today. So yeah, there you have the two kind of seminal figures of American Shakespeare, one in the theater and one in the study, both of whom are Philadelphians.
Spectacular. So you've shown us so vividly how central Shakespeare was to American culture in the 18th and 19th century. And we now need to talk about Shakespeare and the framers. There's a great book, Shakespeare in America, that you recommended to me, edited quotes from letters from presidents, starting with John Adams, about their love of Shakespeare. And the Adams letter is a letter to John Quincy Adams, where Adams says that although at the time of Shakespeare, the English Constitution didn't have the limitations of Magna Carta and habeas corpus, we can still learn more about constitutionalism and liberty from Shakespeare's plays than anyone else. Tell us about John Adams and Shakespeare.
Sure. Well, first of all, that book, Shakespeare in America, I want to plug it for everybody. James Shapiro is the leading American Shakespeare scholar. There are 3 or 4, Marjorie Garber, Stephen Greenblatt, Harold Bloom. But James Shapiro, who's at Columbia University, is really at the moment the dean of American Shakespeare scholars, and he's done a lot of work on the history of Shakespeare in America, including this wonderful anthology that goes from really pre-colonial, early times in America up till right now. Adams loved Shakespeare. There's a famous story where he and Jefferson made a pilgrimage to Shakespeare's house in Stratford-upon-Avon together. Adams apparently was very moved, and Jefferson, the story goes, complained about how expensive everything was. So, I don't know if that's... and they took one of them, I can't remember which, took a penknife and carved a little piece of wood off of what was reputed to be Shakespeare's chair as a little relic. Yeah, and I'm sure they had, an endless supply of chairs that they would just, that's Shakespeare's chair. Somebody would carve a little piece of it, next. So yeah, these were guys who revered Shakespeare, read Shakespeare all the time, and as I said, we know, went to see Shakespeare in the colonial theaters of the day. The interesting thing about Shakespeare is how easy he is to read from different perspectives. We know that Julius Caesar was the most performed play during the American Revolution. Why? Because it tells the story of a group of Republicans coming together and murdering a tyrant. So the narrative matches the narrative that the founders wanted it to tell. They just used it. Now, of course, Caesar ends badly for those revolutionaries, right? Doesn't really work out well. So what they did instead was recitations, excerpts, some highly motivating speech from one character or other, talking about how the Republic is greater than any single monarch, all of that. So right from that point, you see Shakespeare being borrowed to argue a case that was politically expedient at the time. And I think Adams and the others are able to read Shakespeare selectively from that point of view. In other words, it's entirely possible to read Julius Caesar as a monarchist and say the last thing you want is a mob coming and killing the king. You can read Richard II that same way and say that's a bad idea to kill the king because look what happens to the country when you do that, right? But Shakespeare's slippery. And so you can also cherry pick and put together an argument that says, no, actually, he's not that at all. He's a Democrat. You look at a play like Coriolanus, and Coriolanus is all about the voice of the people undoing the plutocrats, the one percenters of Rome, who would, it's a feel the burn kind of play, Coriolanus, if you want to read it that way. So I think that's what's happening there, is in that letter that Adams wrote to his son, he's looking at it and saying, we can find embedded in these plays the ideals that we're trying to represent in our Constitution and at the basis of our republic.
Now, Quincy Adams, a great scholar, Boylston professor of rhetoric at Harvard, also loves Shakespeare, but writes a rather jarring letter about Othello in which he uses it as a caution against miscegenation,
Yeah.
and which is surprising from the heroic defender of the Amistad and the great abolitionist. What was he thinking?
What was he thinking? It's strange. First of all, John Quincy Adams was the only U.S. president to publish Shakespeare criticism, right? So such was his devotion. He actually published works, essays of his own Shakespeare criticism. There's this infamous piece that he writes about Othello where he says, the lesson of this play is white women shouldn't marry black men. It's this stark, nasty, really, and written in the most horrendously racist terms, where he literally says, here's the reason we should do this play, is to teach us that racial mixing should not happen. Now, this from the guy who defended the slaves who rebelled on the Amistad. It's extraordinary to ask how that could live in the same head. And again, I think the point that Shapiro would make is that, once again, there's a problem that's going on in the society about racial mingling. And what Quincy Adams is doing is appealing to a higher authority. You could appeal to God, I suppose, and find some religious text, or you could appeal to Shakespeare and say, let's draw a moral lesson from this great writer. And that's how he construes it. Later generations would read Othello from completely the opposite point of view, as a plea for racial tolerance and acceptance. And by the time Rosen plays Othello in the early 20th century, it's the greatest plea for acceptance of a great black actor that the country had ever seen. So it's tough to understand that. It's one thing to defend a slave who you see as being unjustly persecuted by the law. It's another to have him date your daughter, right? And that seems to be the split consciousness that you see in John Quincy Adams.
That same split consciousness we find in the great Lincoln, who on the one hand freed the slaves and fulfilled the promise of the Declaration of Independence, and on the other insisted that he was trying to achieve not social equality, but civil equality between blacks and whites. Lincoln was a great Shakespearean. He wrote a letter to the famous Falstaff of his day saying he wished he could play Richard III. What did Shakespeare mean to Lincoln?
Shakespeare was an obsession for Abraham Lincoln, and I love that because the greatest ever American had this great bond with the greatest ever writer, and to me proves the case that this is our national writer, and that's an idea that I've devoted my entire professional life to, is the Americanness of Shakespeare, and I love that Lincoln paves the way for me, because I go, listen, I know it's not just my idea, Lincoln thought so too. But we know that he carried around copies of the plays with him from his youngest days. We know that he kept a complete works in the White House. There's a famous anecdote late in the Civil War about his bodyguard coming in one night, finding him asleep somewhere at a table somewhere in the White House. Next to him is Shakespeare open. Lincoln wakes up. And the quote is something like, and with his cavernous and dark eyes, or something like that, he immediately starts to recite tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. He knew vast passages by heart, right? A tale told by an idiot, life's a walking shadow, this bleak, horrible vision in the darkest days of the Civil War. It's remarkable, that he had access to that language to express these things. We know also there's a story that he was sitting for a portrait and bored, sitting there forever while this guy's painting him, and starts launching into Richard III. Just does the opening soliloquy of Richard III, and along the way gives a running commentary about all the actors he's seen mess it up, and how they should have done it. So he had quirky opinions, idiosyncratic opinions. He famously said that Claudius's soliloquy of guilt in Hamlet, "Oh, my offense is rank," is better than "to be or not to be." And then quickly backs off and says, well, I'm no professional critic, of course. But, so he had a deep familiarity with Shakespeare. He turned to Shakespeare all the time. Macbeth was his particular obsession, which is so ironic given what we know happened to him. It's an odd quirk of Lincoln's life.
Self-taught? Was this in the air? Were other
Yeah.
Kentucky boys learning Shakespeare like this?
Well, de Tocqueville tells us as he traveled around the United States in the period that there was a Shakespeare everywhere. That every house he went to, whether it was a mansion in Rhode Island or a shack in some pioneer town in the Midwest, had two books in it, the Bible and Shakespeare. So it was pervasive, and therefore it's not surprising that would have been what would have been around in the log cabin, wherever it was he happened to be, or in his state Senate office in Illinois. This was the literature that was the currency in America at the time.
Sid Blumenthal, who was here at the center recently, said that the reason the standard of constitutional discourse in Congress in the 19th century was so much higher was because people read the Bible and Shakespeare, and now that they don't, it's worse.
Yes, yeah, now they read Twitter. The level of the rhetoric is not quite
To be or not to be sucks.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it. Yeah, to be are
not. Yeah.
not
Beautiful.
to be.
Yeah. Claudius, loser. Yeah.
Right. Precisely.
Yes.
Sadly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's true. And the interesting thing about Lincoln is that you can feel the cadences of Shakespeare in his writing, in his approach to language. I'm not the first to observe this, that, the thing about Shakespeare, the first thing about the study of the way Shakespeare writes is this thing called antithesis. I come not to praise Caesar, but to bury him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth like the gentle rain from heaven, right? So he's constantly, you can't get more than two lines in Shakespeare without opposites being compared. To be or not to be. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York. And when I teach Shakespearean acting, that's the very first lesson. Take your pencil, circle the words that are opposite each other, and stress them when you speak. That's it. So this is antithesis. That's the key to Shakespeare. And you think about Lincoln's most famous turns of phrase, with charity toward all, with malice toward none. That's a Shakespeare locution, no doubt. The world will little note nor long remember, but it will never forget. That's a Shakespearean construction. So whether or not that's literally what was going on, whether he was consciously trying to emulate Shakespeare or not, whether or not antithesis just happens to be a very effective rhetorical tool for politicians, that's also true. Martin Luther King, we should be judged not by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. Or, Kennedy, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That's antithesis. These are the lines that stick in our brains, and Shakespeare knew that, and Lincoln knew that. The other Shakespeare trick that Lincoln does a lot is he will end a big passage with words of one syllable. That's a big Shakespeare trick. A lot of Shakespeare's big famous speeches end with a series of single syllable words. So Richard II does, for God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings, that famous speech. And it ends with, how can you say to me, I am a king? Single syllable words, right? So you think about the Gettysburg Address, and it ends with, shall not perish from the earth, right? And that's this beautiful Shakespearean idea of finishing on a boom, 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 not with a fancy word, not with some complicated idea, but with simple monosyllables that just punch. Yeah.
President Obama, our most literate of presidents, does not employ that device. Why not? And are there others who do today? Is it still modern? And could a politician be Shakespearean and still connect?
Well, if only,
Well, he could do it. He's obviously capable of doing it, but he's chosen not to.
I don't know. I think that, this goes to a much bigger question about when Shakespeare went from being in every pioneer's hut to being in the university English department and in the highbrow world in which I now operate, right? We're so busy at the Old Globe, as all my colleagues in the theaters around the country are, trying to get Shakespeare back into the popular imagination. And it's hard because our ticket prices are expensive and so on and so forth, But in, post-war America, I think, and believe me, I hesitate to say this on the record because I'm a product of university English departments, and I revere them, and all my friends teach in them, But the professionalization of Shakespeare as the province of the university professor has moved him away from being in the common currency. And I think now, if President Obama were to get up and give some ringing line of Shakespeare, it would smack as elitist in a way that in the 19th century it never would have done. He came close in his first inaugural, and I'm going to have to remember it. He talked about the winter of our. He didn't say winter of our discontent. That's the famous Richard III. Now is the winter of our discontent. He talked about something like the season of our discontent, or the winter of our difficulty, or something like that. And it was just a little glance in the direction of Shakespeare, but didn't quite go there. Whereas in the UK, Shakespeare's birthday was in April, and I watched the Prime Minister's questions that day, and it was just this extravaganza where David Cameron went down this list. He was attacking Labour, and it was just one line of Shakespeare after another, mocking, what their foolish policies for this or that, and just wheeling out Shakespeare quote after Shakespeare quote after Shakespeare quote. It's possible there. I just don't think it's possible here, to my deep regret. I wish Obama would.
Boris Johnson can quote Shakespeare, and it's just a different university system.
Yeah.
But you are taking Shakespeare to the people, and you're taking them into prisons. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's right. Well, a movement is springing up in the American theater that is really saying, okay, it's time for this regional theater system that we've built over 60 years now to recognize that it is not serving the entire community. The Old Globe has been around for 80 years. We're the 6th largest regional theater in the country, in San Diego of all places, right? With a massive reputation for Shakespeare and for all sorts of other stuff. But the truth is that the demographic of our audience and the demographic of the city of San Diego just don't resemble each other. For any of you who are patrons of any elite nonprofit institution, you know who's sitting in the audience with you when you're there. It doesn't represent the broadest demographic of the city. And we can't allow that. That just can't stand anymore. We're a publicly funded institution, and we have a moral responsibility, an ethical responsibility to share our work with as broad a constituency as possible. So theaters like the Public Theater in New York, the California Shakespeare Theater in San Francisco, the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis, we're all looking at ways to get our work out into the underserved communities as much as we can. And what we do is we take professional Shakespeare to homeless shelters, refugee centers, libraries, community centers, military installations, and correctional facilities for free. And you really start to see Shakespeare resonating with that audience, that popular, broad audience that loved him in the 19th century of America. It's an extraordinary thing.
Tell us about a story of Shakespeare in prison.
Sure. Well, one of the things we do is we try, and every once in a while we'll say, well, what play would be interesting to do in these environments? And there's Shakespeare's play Measure for Measure. Half of it is set in a prison. Huge parts of that play take place in a prison. And to watch people who have experienced the justice system from the other side watch this play and interact with this play is just hugely moving. The plot, just very simply, there's the Duke, it takes place in Vienna. The Duke decides to take off for an unexplained reason, and he leaves in charge a kind of law and order guy named Angelo. And the first thing Angelo does is he shuts down all the brothels in town and goes on a moral crusade to clean up sex crimes in the city. He arrests a young man for fornication who's put in jail. This young man has a sister who's a nun, and he asks her to go plead his case to Angelo. She goes. She says, please forgive my brother. He's a good guy. You shouldn't do this. And he says, oh, I'll do that. I'll let him off the hook if you sleep with me, to this nun. And she has a great soliloquy where she turns to the audience in disbelief that she's just been propositioned by this official, government official. And she says, "To whom shall I complain?" And we did this in a women's prison in New York. And some woman shouted out, "Nobody, girl, you're on your own." Right? So to understand, first of all, that sense that there's an instant rapport between the actors, and we know that about Shakespeare's own audience. It's broad daylight, open air. There was a wide range of people in that theater, and there was an unending communication back and forth. If you go see Shakespeare at the Globe in London, where they recreate those circumstances, you see a give and take between the audience. It's not our sense, which is a Victorian sense, that the audience is supposed to sit in the dark and keep quiet, and the actors are the only ones who get to talk. That wasn't the case. So it's this very authentically Elizabethan one. Another one is Much Ado About Nothing, which has in it a comic policeman named Dogberry. Well, when you do a comic policeman in a prison, it's, I forgive the word, a riot. I mean, it's, there's a very famous comic sequence where somebody calls him an ass, and he doesn't know what that means, so he insists that that be written down. And he keeps on saying, "Mark me down, ass. Mark me down, ass." Right? Very fun. And when this guy did this in this prison, the guys went crazy. So somehow, it was, for this one moment, Shakespeare licensed them to laugh at these guards who are standing there. By the way, we're performing this thing in a basketball court at a level 3 prison out of 4 in California. And there's a guy on a catwalk with a automatic military style, that's what you're talking about. And they're laughing at the cop. So it's this strange inversion that happens, because once again, as we were saying earlier, the Shakespeare's ideas about justice, you do measure for measure at the Police Benevolent Association, and that doesn't get a laugh, but you do it in the prison, and it does. So he's kaleidoscopic in that way. It's a wonderful thing,
Back to the presidents and the founders, John Wilkes Booth, such a Shakespeare, obviously actor, but so learned in it that he quotes Julius Caesar in his letter justifying the assassination.
Yeah, weirdly, he wrote a letter. It's in Shapiro's book. He wrote a letter on the day that he murdered Lincoln, justifying his actions, talking about slavery as a wonderful institution, talking about how what Lincoln's been doing has been unconstitutional, and there's only one thing for it. And he quotes Brutus in Julius Caesar. There's a scene early in the play where Brutus gathers the conspirators, and he does this wild thing. They all are talking about the fact that they're going to have to murder this man. But Brutus says, let's call it a sacrifice, not a murder, right? He's desperately trying to euphemize it and make it sound like it's a good thing. And they can't avoid the fact that it's going to involve knives in this man's flesh and a lot of blood, but they're desperately trying to use language to turn it into something else. And so Wilkes Booth quotes from that and says, I wish I could, I don't know it, Jeff, I'm sorry, off the top of my head, but the line is something like, I wish it were possible to get rid of Caesar and not make him bleed, but we can't do that. And so we're going to have to make him bleed. And the last line of the letter is, I stand with Brutus, signed John Wilkes Booth. It's just bone-chilling.
Shakespeare was trained in a system designed to train lawyers and to encourage ratiocination, a civil service system, you were telling me.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I don't think it's an accident that lawyers are drawn to Shakespeare and have been drawn to Shakespeare in places like the Shakespeare Society of Philadelphia. And that's because what happened a generation or so before Shakespeare was the Tudor regime, Henry VIII and his ministers, recognized that the government was getting too big for them to administer, and they needed to create a cadre of civil servants who could manage the government. And so there was this massive education reform, really a revolution in England, funded by the Tudor regime, where they just built schools to train the future generation of civil servants who would run the country. These were the famous grammar schools, where what you learned was one thing: rhetoric. That's what you learned. You started out, you would memorize the great speeches of Cicero or whomever and learn all the rhetorical techniques that were being used. Then you would write your own copies, exercises to try and emulate those rhetorical techniques. And that was the entire basis of the Elizabethan education, was classical rhetoric. They didn't intend it this way, but it turned out to be the greatest factory for playwrights ever devised. It's no accident that the English Renaissance in drama happened a generation after this explosion of grammar schools, because all these young men who were trained in that technique started writing plays that way. And when you look at Shakespeare, Marlowe, Johnson, Ford, Middleton, Marston, Dekker, all those guys that were writing at the time, they're all writing in this highly rhetorical style. Shakespeare has a difference. He's able to transcend imaginatively in a way that many of these other guys were not, had a gift for metaphor that some of these other guys did not, but nonetheless, it's highly rhetorical. It's about making an argument. It's about stating a thesis and then bringing in evidence to explicate and defend that thesis, then wrapping it up with a conclusion. Highly, highly rhetorical. And so, litigators love Shakespeare because that's exactly what they're trained to do. Martial language in order to persuade. And the basic structure, unlike if you're looking at a play by David Mamet or Sam Shepard or Tony Kushner or somebody like that, that's a different kind of writing. What Shakespeare and those guys are doing is highly conscious language that is deliberately being structured to maximally persuade and to put a point of view with maximal strength. So it's a lawyer's lingo, it's the texture of the law. And it's not surprising to me at all that even today, Justice Stevens is a great Shakespearean. Justice Ginsburg is this summer going to Venice. A friend of mine is directing a production of The Merchant of Venice in the Jewish ghetto. And Justice Ginsburg is going to go there and hold a moot court about whether or not Shylock was justified in his getting his pound of flesh, right? So to this day, there is this tremendous overlap between the legal profession and Shakespeare because that legalism of language is in the DNA of the way Shakespeare writes.
Speaking of the legalism of language, here at the Constitution Center, we spend a lot of time studying the methodologies of constitutional interpretation so that all of you can distinguish between originalism and textualism and natural law-based theories and pragmatism. Are there similar debates in the interpretation of Shakespeare?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think in a third world, it would be interesting also to have on this panel a theologian, because I think in the law and in the classical theater and in theology or divinity, what you have is old canonical texts and generations of interpreters and schools of thought about how they should be interpreted. You call it a rabbi, a lawyer, and a Shakespeare professor walk into a bar.
No, they walk into the Constitution Center.
They walk into the Constitution Center, right?
Yeah.
When I take a look around here, I had a wonderful couple of hours this morning exploring this marvelous, marvelous place. And you see things that look very familiar to me, which is, here's this text. And number one, this text exists in slightly different versions because of printing technology in the period, because of revisions that were made. Same is true of Shakespeare. So first, you've got the scholarship that is about how can we actually determine what's the authentic and original text, and why is that comma there? Because that comma there changes the entire meaning of the sentence. Was it a printer's mistake? What was it? Then there are points of view about originalism versus some sort of more progressive interpretation. And we have at the moment at the Old Globe a production of Macbeth that is pretty on the avant-garde spectrum for our very traditional Shakespeare audience. And I'm getting letters saying I'm a Shakespeare purist. There's an audience that wants ruffs and doublet and hose and pumpkin pants, but there's also an audience that wants modern dress and interpretations of the play that are consciously trying to acknowledge change in society over time. So I think it's tremendously analogous.
I mean, if you're trying to discern Shakespeare's original intent in one of the his history plays, do you try to figure out what he thought about royalty?
You can do a number of things. First, you can read the books that we know he read and try and understand how he's departing from them and what that means, what perspective that departure might suggest about his worldview. The other thing is that the plays exist. Half of Shakespeare's plays were not printed during his lifetime and only survive because of this famous book, The First Folio of 1623, where 18 of his plays are printed for the first time. That's the only text we have. None of his manuscript pages survive. But the other 18 plays were printed during Shakespeare's lifetime and so exist in multiple versions. And you can track him making changes, or somebody making changes in the text over time. And then you can start to discern, well, why did he change that? Why did he modify that idea? Why did this idea change? And you can come to understand his, maybe, point of view about a certain idea.
I'm so lucky to have this conversation, and I could keep going, but as usual, our phenomenal audience questions are better than anything I could come up with, so here they are.
All right.
What principles in the U.S. Constitution do you relate directly to Shakespeare?
Okay, now I'm way on a limb here because my knowledge of the Constitution is not as thorough as my knowledge of Shakespeare. So help me out here, Jeff. I don't know that one can make a one-to-one correlation. I certainly think that you see in, for example, in the Henry VI plays, you see crowds assembling in order to express themselves and succeeding in making change. There are 2 or 3 cases of this in Shakespeare where a crowd will get together and affect a policy. So I suppose, depending on what happens, in some of them those get suppressed, sometimes violently. In some of them they are just absolutely mocked and vilified by the patricians who don't want to see that crowd assembled. But Shakespeare, as a man of the theater, seems to be okay with the idea of a crowd. After all, he needed crowds to make a living. And so that idea of assembly and expression, I suppose you can see dramatized many times in the play.
Well, if one idea of constitutionalism is the idea of limited government and unconstrained majorities, is that a Shakespearean idea? Does he suspect the mob?
He does. Again, if you look at Julius Caesar, for example, right, there you see the counterexample where you see Mark Antony, the demagogue, rile up a crowd to violence by appealing to their basest, most craven interests, scary stuff, where a guy who has the gift of language is able to stir up a mob to incendiary violence. And that's clearly something that Shakespeare recoils from. So, yes.
How do you suggest we revive teaching Shakespeare in all American classrooms? That's a version I was going to ask. How do I persuade my wonderful 9-year-olds to read Shakespeare?
Yeah, what a great question. And that's something we're thinking an enormous amount about at the Globe at the moment. And I can answer it by citing success in 2 foreign countries. One is in England and one is in Australia, where the leading Shakespeare companies in both of those countries, the Royal Shakespeare Company in the UK and a company called Bell Shakespeare, based in Sydney, are doing extraordinary work introducing Shakespeare to kids as young as 4 years old. Amazing. It's absolutely uncanny to see what they're doing. Simply by the big sort of paradigm shift, the big leap that they've made, is you have to get the kids up and speaking the language. That's the thing. That's actually, it seems obvious, everybody's nodding. So, yeah, of course you have to do that. But actually that's a pretty new idea. And so what these great theater companies are doing is devising educational curricula for the youngest kids that's all about getting the kids up and speaking the words, as opposed to reading them, where they're really difficult and remote, and the words are complicated, and the spellings are weird, and the grammar is strange. No, get up, say it. And having just unbelievable success. I was just reading, there's a story in The Guardian a couple of days ago about some school in a very impoverished little seaside town in northeast England where nothing's going on. And some progressive school principal imported the Royal Shakespeare Company's curriculum, and over the course of 2 years completely turned the school around. It's one of the most successful schools in the country at the moment, driven by this curriculum that's about getting kids up. My kids, Jeff, both my kids can recite long passages of Shakespeare, and the thing is, my son, who's 4, will say, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears." And he doesn't know what it means, but the words have a musicality to them and a muscularity to them, And I can't wait for the day when I'm directing Julius Caesar at the Old Globe, and that speech comes along, and my son, whatever age he'll be at that time, will just get a little charge from the fact that that's my line, So that is the way to do it. There are these curricula around. They have not quite made it to the United States yet. They're going to. And it's about getting young kids up and actually doing the stuff as opposed to reading it. That's what's going to save us.
Any attempts to Hamiltonize Shakespeare with rap?
There have been, yeah. There was a very successful show in New York, 10 years ago, called The Bombity of Errors, which was a hip-hop comedy of errors, predating Hamilton. I think, frankly, that's probably all you're going to see now, because people are going to be imitating that in the hope of capturing some of its lightning in a bottle. I think that the great and wonderful effect of Hamilton, although Shakespeare's already been there, is going to be about diversity, right? The huge, wonderful, amazing thing about Hamilton is the rainbow of people on that stage, and the idea that some young Latino is playing one of our white founding fathers, and that's just cool. Nobody has any issue with it. Shakespeare in America since the 60s, when the great Joe Papp created Shakespeare in the Park in New York, routinely does that. We never do an all-white Shakespeare at the Globe, nor could we ever get away with it, nor would we want to. It's everybody's, and we try and reflect the demographics of our society in the way that we cast the plays. I think the Hamilton effect is going to be to see that happen more and more and more and more, and break down these expectations that no, only certain kind of roles are for certain kind of people. I think that's going to be the wonderful legacy that show leaves our theater.
I mean, you could obviously do the plots, but you'd lose the language.
Yeah, and that's a very controversial thing. Some of you may know that last year, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, one of the great Shakespeare companies in the United States, commissioned a series of modern language adaptations of Shakespeare and caused a huge storm. It got to the point where my friend James Shapiro, who we've been talking about all afternoon, editorialized against it in the New York Times. Imagine. I actually took that as a good sign, that Shakespeare was interesting enough to people to merit a fire-breathing editorial in the pages of the New York Times. I thought that was a good sign. And the idea there, and I want to defend it because I actually think it's really interesting, is they're just giving modern, young American playwrights a chunk of money and saying, just write a version of Shakespeare's story in your own language. Are they ever going to produce them? Who knows? Do they ever think that they're going to supplant Shakespeare? No, definitively not. But what they are going to do is build some muscles for these playwrights, because I can promise you, and I know this from my own life, when you spend 1 year with Hamlet, you become better. If you're going to try and write To Be or Not to Be in modern English, you're going to learn something about the power of language. So for me, giving a playwright $15,000 and saying, go write a modern version of Henry V is a gift to that playwright, whatever turns out at the end of it. And that's why I support it. So yeah, I suppose you probably will see somebody do some hip-hop adaptation of Shakespeare. God knows there have been jazz, there's a famous Duke Ellington Twelfth Night. There are people that have done other pop music translations of Shakespeare over the years, so why not?
How's the Ellington?
The Ellington's wonderful. It's revived every once in a while. The score is amazing. Yeah.
A related question. In general, what do you think of efforts to place Shakespeare in a contemporary setting? And in particular, are you familiar with Anne Tyler's new book where she sets The Taming of the Shrew in Baltimore?
Yeah. So there's this series, I don't know, is that part of the British series of the modernized Shakespeare's? Because they're doing one. The Brits went crazy over the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, and one of the things they did was commissioned major novelists. Howard Jacobson did The Merchant of Venice, and basically their charge was take the plot of the play and make a modern story in your novel. And these things amount to extraordinary readings of these plays, revelatory readings of what's in these plays, really wonderful. So I'm not specifically familiar with the Ann Tyler, but I think that's, I don't have a problem with it. He's part of the cultural currency, Shakespeare, and we should be able to interpret him and make him make sense for our modern world. I guess that puts me on the progressive interpretive side, but that's how I see it. I love modern dress productions of Shakespeare, as long as what they're doing is illuminating the play. There's a famous phrase, the great director Tyrone Guthrie, after whom the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis is named, said of modern dress Shakespeare that the problem is that you can blow the dust off convention straight into the audience's eyes. And that's the problem. If what you're doing is dressing up Macbeth in a business suit simply because you think it's cool, then it doesn't make any sense. But if your production can open up something inside the text and illuminate the text through modern imagery, then I love it and I applaud it. And there have been landmark productions of Shakespeare that have taken him and applied him to some, controversial political or social issue of the time by finding in him some modern analog that seems to illuminate the play. And I love that, if it's done by someone with skill.
One favorite example of that?
Okay, let's see. Well, one of the greatest, and to me still one of the top 10 productions of Shakespeare I've ever seen in my life, is Peter Sellers' production of The Merchant of Venice, which he did in the early 90s in the wake of the Rodney King riots. And he set, Peter Sellers, of course, very famous avant-garde, not the actor, but the theater director, Peter Sellers, hugely famous American avant-gardist, the guy who set Così fan tutte in a diner, right?
And Figaro in the Trump Tower.
And Figaro in the Trump Tower. Can't
Yes,
forget
indeed.
that. That's true.
Yes,
We
he
should
did.
time to revive it.
It is time. On a nonpartisan basis.
That's true. So he did a very famous production of The Merchant of Venice set in Venice, California, in which the Christian men were Latino gangbangers, and Portia and Nerissa were Asian Americans, and Shylock and his daughter were black, and the only white characters were the clown Lancelot Gobbo and the Duke of Venice. And he used Shakespeare's language, completely uncut, unaltered Shakespeare's language, told the story, but what you ended up seeing was it's this play about minority, this Jew Shylock, this woman Portia, this homosexual Antonio, in this monolithic white wasp world, and these minority groups are sort of grabbing for their place in it. And that's what he showed us. He showed us California as it was then, and the consequences were fire on the streets, as is what happens in the play. This terrible, terrible destruction of this man for daring to proclaim his voice in a rigged system, right? So by casting the play that way, he ended up using Shakespeare to show us an X-ray of what was happening in America at the time. Absolutely one of the most thrilling pieces of theater I've ever seen.
I saw Sellers' Don Giovanni in the 80s, set in Spanish Harlem, with two African-American twins as Don Giovanni and Leporello, and driving back, you drive through Spanish Harlem, and I was weeping. It was overwhelming, the emotional impact of that.
He's one of the great artists we've ever created, Peter Sellers.
To sum up a conversation that I really wish didn't have to end, as we've talked, it seems to me that if the framers were inspired by Shakespeare, it was less for his politics, because his politics are elusive and encompass multiple perspectives, but for his use of language and persuasion and sense that liberty could be protected through language. But help me sharpen that point.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I love the stories of the presidents turning to Shakespeare, and there are others. There's a famous story of Ronald Reagan at some school event, just breaking into tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. and then saying to the children that he was talking to, I hope you never are as pessimistic as that man who said those lines. Then Bill Clinton said the same speech in some other event, and I love this phrase. He says that for him, Macbeth is a perfect illustration of the problem of ambition that is divorced from a higher purpose. So I think that what these politicians, our framers and today, are finding in Shakespeare is the same thing that you find in a canonical religious text or a canonical legal text, which is a repository of ethical values. Not necessarily moral values, but ethical values that help us orient ourselves in confusing times, because it has survived for 400 years and it has transcended language and place and time and is enduring and will continue to endure. And so in a confusing moment, in a moment of great upheaval, one can sort of hold onto it as a sort of anchor. And I think that's when you read about Adams and Jefferson and Washington turning to these places, that's what they're looking for, is a kind of ethical beacon by which they can navigate. And that's what I think Shakespeare offers us.
Final question speaks for all of us. Please come back again. Please join me in thanking Edelstein.
Thank you, Jeffrey. That was great.